In fact, one thing you should definitely remember is that this fantasy world is in your own head. In reality, you're only typing words on a computer screen. Just keep telling yourself that. No doubt on your part.
We have a smaller group today. Welcome to the last session of Internet Real Life. Today we have Reggie James, our speaker. I noticed on your Substack you say that you identify as a writer. You just are one. I mean, I guess both are true.
Both are true.
Uh, yeah, I'm excited for his talk today. Peter, want to jump in before we get going?
Oh, just a fan of your work, Reggie, and excited that you're here.
Yeah. So yeah, you could let's kick it off.
Awesome. I totally am having a mini blank if I was supposed to talk about spiritual technology or hardware. Which one was it? I have
Spir
two things ready, so either way we will.
Spiritual technology, but both are interesting.
Okay.
So yeah, spiritual technology is what we're expecting, but follow your heart.
Okay, no, I'm just double checking. It's been a week. Okay, cool. So nice to meet everyone. So this presentation, this talk is uh uh not a direct copy of what I presented at Hereticon, but very much sort of branched off of that. And I've been working on we kind of call ourselves like a fringe research group. We're trying to find like that intersection of like where Esalen meets MIT Media Lab. And so really thinking through sort of spiritual technology and its counterforce, which I we dub as secutech or secular technology, and a really clear sort of you know environment awakening, sort of like your fish and water effect, and you've been living in like secular technology probably your whole life. So um I think the problem, the problem statement is something along the lines that, our technical environment, the secular technology environment is deeply inconsiderate of religious practice and tradition and effects. And I come from a Christian background. My parents were short-term missionaries. So most of the examples I use will be through a Christian reference, as I'm not as well versed in other religious practices, but we really do view this as a sort of broadly secular versus broadly religious paradigm. So, what is secutech, right? What is like secular technology? And what I view it as is sort of this technology designed and embodied through a postmodernist perspective. I have like two screens working, so if I'm not looking directly at the camera, that's why. And so to kind of grok this whole thing, we kind of have to go into sort of two main things. One, just sort of, what do we mean by embodiment? This is more of a design question. And then, when I say postmodernism, which is already a hotly contested sort of thing, what do I mean by postmodernism? So let's start with design, because that's sort of the easier one. One of my favorite designers is this Japanese industrial designer, Naoto Fukuzawa. And he references design as very straightforwardly an embodiment of values. And so, we can think of products and our built environment as value assertions, right? Both in their existence and in the case of, many digital technologies, every use, every app open. One example I like to give for maybe folks that are less design oriented is just around chairs. Often when we talk about chairs, we talk about a system of affordances. So I'm sitting, well, actually, I have like tights on underneath, so I'm not gonna give you guys a leg show. But I'm sitting in this Eames this Eames office chair, and it has like these metal bars as handles. Very hard to throw my legs over the side, right? Also kind of hard, like if my wife wants to sit in my lap. Like this chair is about locking in. It's about being at a desk. Whereas we have a Mario Bellini style sort of modular couch system. And that is very much about sort of throwing your legs over and laying over it and all these affordances, right? The same is true for our technology. We're going to do an exercise of this in a little bit. But postmodernism, what is postmodernism? So I really like this quote from Hans Bertens that says, if there is a common denominator to all of these postmodernisms, it is that of a crisis in representation, a deeply felt loss of faith in our ability to represent the real in the wildest sense. No matter whether they are aesthetic, epistemological, moral, or political in nature, the representations that we used to rely on can no longer be taken for granted. I was in San Francisco a couple of days ago, and my mentor, who's a well-known designer, had this sort of that's good. My mentor, who's a well-known designer, has been listening to these Alan Watts recordings, and there's this point where Alan Watts says, these questions of reality, and then he just sort of hits a gong. He says, "That's it," and I think in a very real way, postmodernism is not that. It is not a hitting of a gong for direct presence. And I think when we think about, the sort of secu-tech as this postmodernism definition and this design definition, we can really start to just look at our environment through all these values, right? Crisis of representation, social media. Everyday social media just asks you who you are, and that creates a crisis. You're not supposed to be asked who you are every day. That is actually not healthy. You start to question that, and then I think we see very emergent behaviors as a form of almost like digital psychosis. Relativism, right? So information and sort of media wars or disinformation, like this is a feature of postmodernism. It's not a bug. And I think when sort of like political figures are like, we have to solve misinformation, disinformation, it's like, well, maybe, maybe, but that's it's built from the environment. And we can kind of go down a list of sort of postmodernist values and kind of map it to our environment. But then I think, for the technologists in the rooms or just the broadly capitalists, I think the question becomes like, what's the problem? Netflix is a good company, Uber's a good company, and they seem to thrive off of these values. But I think the stakes are much higher than just pure capital incentives, right? I think, what's at stake is sort of the current existential crisis of technology, which is sort of AI. And, what I like to say is they're trying to build God lowercase g, right? And so it's like technologists being obsessed with reaching God lowercase g as technology instead of reaching God uppercase G through technology. And I think that difference is really, really critical and a main difference of secu-tech versus spiritual technology. Spiritual technology is concerned about reaching God through, not as. Marshall McLuhan is kind of like my intellectual advisor, spiritually speaking, at least. Obviously he's passed away, but he has this really great framework of technology as amputation. And I really love using this framework as it pertains to AI, because I think, if we're trying to reach God as technology, then we have to understand like, okay, well, what is the property of God we're trying to reach with any given technology, right? Maybe you can think of planes as very slow omnipresence, right? Modern planes just give us the ability to be anywhere within a day, and that's really dope and powerful. It's not perfect omnipresence, but video technology is kind of a sense of omnipresence as well, which is why we don't like surveillance states. Anyway, AI, I kind of view as like omniscience. And I think if AI is omniscience, then like what's at stake in terms of amputation is our own lobotomy, right? And I think that's what scares me. Like, it doesn't really scare me if I don't have to work. This is like, listen, my mom's Dominican. I'll go to Dominican Republic. I'll be on a beach. I don't care about not working, really. I do care about sort of being a pile of useless limbs because my brain literally just doesn't work anymore. And I think that's a real problem. And so there's another sort of framework that I like to understand also from a design impact which is McLuhan's tetrad. I think for the sake of time and maybe getting to more interactive, because I don't like just speaking, I'll save that one. But the example I really like to use is mobile sports betting, which I think is maybe like one of the bigger demonic influences of our current times. And to use the framework is like mobile sports betting amplifies watching, right? Like if previous adrenaline rushes came from just watching sports happen, now it comes from my involvement in that sport. It obsolesces the gambling house and the diamond district and like the uncut gems drama of it all, which is also acting as a sort of deterrence force, right? Like going to a seedy gambling house is a deterrence force on the moral structure of the behavior, right? It retrieves personal stakes in events that don't involve you. And then it reverses tribal loyalty. So it's no longer about like, I am rooting for the Lakers, but instead it's about, I'm hoping LeBron gets 20 points and 5 rebounds. And I'm hoping this guy on the other team that I don't want to win does get 30 points. And I'm hoping like, that parlay structure creates a very weird reversal of tribal loyalties. And that is sort of how we can sort of start to look at a way to also subvert secular technology. If like at the worst of, let's say, mobile sports betting is this hyper amplification of your adrenaline and this reversing of tribal loyalties, what can like sort of subdue you and re-tribalize you could be like the sort of cure to sports betting in particular, right? Because I'm more of a outbuild the demon, not like try to subdue the demon kind of guy. So then I think, the question shifts sort of beyond like an argument of morality, right? Which, I make for mobile sports betting is more on this question of like how SecuTech has actively just reduced religion, right? I think like what's at stake is this idea of like, is religion being reduced? And this really comes, for me, this idea of like behavior crowding. Like per that I think it's a AI paper, it's like attention is all you need, right? Like if Silicon Valley is good at one thing, it's like attention hacking, right? And in Kevin Kelly's What Technology Wants, he talks about like technology is really good at making us look at it to fiddle with it. Naturally, with finite amount of time, that means something else is getting crowded out. And my position, at least this year of like studying this, is that what's being crowded out is just religious practice and religious ritual and the technologies around religious practice. And so then you might ask, okay, well, what are, spiritual technologies? And the one I really like, probably because of my grandmother, who is a very Dominican Catholic, is the Catholic Rosary. And what is the Catholic Rosary? What is the sort of study of effect? What is the formula? And I would say, the Rosary, shout out Ivan Illich, yes. Everything's been said, everything's been said. I'm not claiming this is all original. So what is the Rosary? The Rosary is this act of taking time out of the day, closing your eyes, chanting a prayer, repetition, running fingers over beads, which is actually common across multiple religious technology tools, meditating on a mystery. And what this equals is a more graciously experienced day, which I think is what a lot of people are probably spiritually after. I think you could do this exact same thing with like, what is Twitter? Like Twitter is unlocking a device, opening an app, a finger running over a screen. This is like your new Catholic Rosary. And our hope, is essentially a more informed day. Now we know that's not true. Like Twitter has clearly gone past that, but it's the same exact ritualistic experience in order to achieve some type of stylistically or aesthetically viewed day. Whether or not that's serving us spiritually becomes the new question. But it's a question that if all you know is a sort of secular technology environment, it's really hard to even ask that question. And And so this is sort of like, where I get a little hereticon, at least for the talk, which was like, we all talk about like the meme of like the God-shaped hole in our heart, but my meme is like there's a God-shaped hole in our economy, and all we've done is sort of like fill it with like the soul cycles of the world, right? It's using this religious imagery. It tends to have to do with fitness, like work out your body, work out your mind. They're trying to create these sort of principles, but you simply can't replace God, in my opinion. You can't. And this is where it gets, pretty Christian. But, I just think that the sort of there's a statue at the Met in New York, which is where I'm based. And a woman is like standing very casually holding a crucifix. And it looks just like she's holding a phone. Like it is the exact same pose. She's like, it's very casual. Her hip is popped. She's leaning on one leg. And so you see people take photos with it, with them holding their phone. And you just see this direct translation of just the object in hand ism. And so, it's kind of like the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was like making folks believe he doesn't exist type of vibe. And so yeah, again, the entire point of this to me is like this awakening of environment. And so let's say like you see the problems with like secu-tech. Let's say you're like really vibing on like old technologies. Yes, used to do rosary in groups. Completely true. There's a verse in the Bible that says, where two or more are gathered, there I am. And that has to do with, the Holy Spirit being present in the midst of believers. These are social things. I think one of the really unfortunate, maybe, views of social Christianity today is that the image of it is the super church. It's like, it's the Hillsongs. It's people like swinging on the chandeliers, and it's not, maybe as a counterexample of social Christianity, like Quaker practices, which is like sitting in a meeting room waiting for movement and light, and it's far more meditative. James Turrell is a Quaker, and if you look at sort of his light installations compared to Quaker architecture, you can actually see a very one-to-one translation. Anyway, so yeah, let's say like you kind of see these problems of secu-tech and you see old spiritual technology, and you're like, okay, well, like what do we do? I think that researching and helping to wake people up to their environment is a very actual worthwhile task today. I'm not one to sort of run into the burning building and say, what you need is a hose. It's like, well, maybe we can spray water first. And I think that one of the perversions of Silicon Valley is this idea of inevitability, that we love to paint things as inevitable in technology. AI is inevitable. Crypto is inevitable, and it's sort of on some like manufacturing consent type of vibe, and I think something McLuhan says is like, there's no inevitability where there's sort of the willingness to question and to probe and to sort of really ask like the whys. I don't know how many people saw this most recent film, Conclave. I'm really sort of obsessed with it, but if you haven't seen it, I'm not sort of ruining anything, but the homily before they enter the conclave, there's this beautiful statement, and the sin that the protagonist is most afraid of is certainty, because certainty erodes the need for faith, and faith is critical. And I think sort of like the rationalist SF technologists, they're oriented around questions of certainty and truth and mechanizing those things. And I think I personally believe that the world is far more mystical than that our spiritual condition is really real, and you can't necessarily just view it through a rationalist venture style lens. And this comes back to sort of where we started, because I love loops. I like to DJ, so I like forming loops. But, it comes back to where we started, which is this question of technology as God versus using technology to get through to God. And I think the rationalist SF technologist is really, really just certain of their ability to build these mini gods. And I think that completely erodes the mysticism of what it means to get through to God. And I think we should all be far more concerned with that latter point, because I don't think much. I think we'll set up a whole new set of problems with the former goals. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this. Was I took a lot of notes. I mean, this is a lot to think about. Something that kept coming up for me during your talk is like, do you think that the way technology, like, do you think we're not active enough with the technology we have, and that's part of it?
With the spiritual technologies that we have?
With SecuTech, like it doesn't require enough of us, like we're not doing enough somehow.
That's interesting. Because intuitively I would say we're doing too much with the technologies that we already have. And this is my point on like kind of like behavior crowding. Like we're really on these things.
We're not, with I guess with the exception of like scrolling and holding our phone, we're not moving. We're not actually doing anything. It's the illusion of doing. And I
Sure.
wonder if like if it's in some way like if it was more active, like the rosary is, I love that analogy, praying the rosary and scrolling Twitter, but praying the rosary is so much more active.
Yes. I see what you're saying now by active. Yeah. I have this phrase that I've been sort of like putting out into the world, which is like, Apple and their whole ethos on like computers, the bicycle for the mind. And I had this moment looking at a baby being given an iPad, and I was like, wow, we've turned the computer for the mind, or the bicycle for the mind into a pacifier. And I don't think that's actually untrue for ourselves as well. Like I think these are like pacifier devices. Like when we're anxious, we like pick up our phone. And the whole thing about like phantom pain, like when you lose a limb and you feel, and like people have the sensation of pain in a section that like literally doesn't exist anymore. I think we have the same thing with our like computing devices. Like the anxiety meter goes up if it's not actively in hand. So I do hear what you're saying now in terms of like we're not active enough, because it is literally not mobilizing. It is like a somnambulant force. I agree with that. I think we would be more aware of our technical environment if it made us more active, and because it's sort of pacifying, the numbing effect is very.
I feel like people who are very optimistic about technology, like Tyler Cowen, I don't think he said this explicitly, but it was sort of implied in his conversation with John Haidt, that AI would be active in that way. Which seems, I'm noticing, I mean, that's not how it, for me, it's like a calculator for everything.
Yeah.
Right. Like, give me a recipe. Like it's the worst thing I've been doing every day is like, I have this shit in my fridge. What should I make? Instead of with it, and that type of amputation seems, I mean, that's actually scarier to me than any other usage, just like outsourcing too many small tasks like that. I was getting anxious, like hearing you sort of like validate those concerns of like, I gotta stop today. Like,
yeah, it's real. It's real. And I think that amputation framework is useful because of how graphic it is, yeah.
Peter, I was wondering if you wanted to jump in with any thoughts.
Yeah, I got a share and a question. Thanks, Reggie. That was awesome talk. First, the share. I was in the summer. I was a philosopher in residence for Daylight Computers. I'm not sure if you heard.
Oh yeah, no. Anjan and I did the New York launch event for.
Okay, cool. I was helping. I wrote their manifesto, and I was with them in the summer. And as you know, he's trying to create like a spiritual technology. And for those who don't know, Daylight is it's like the world's first blue light free tablet. It's pretty cool. It looks like a Kindle and it has an amber glow, but it has like a refresh rate as an iPad. And they have like these awesome mottos, like do less so you can do more, make your screens less colorful so your world can be more so. And he's like, Anjan argues like the screens are moving closer to our faces, and they're going to be embedded in us. And his vision is to have it outward so we can be embodied. So related to that, the question is, I'm Christian as well, Orthodox Christian, and I agree with you that religion and like an embrace of God is needed. But what do you think about another spiritual technology, or what some called psychotechnology, something like an intentional martial art to like resist against the hell world push of technology?
Mm. Say the martial arts piece again.
Like an attentional martial arts, so just like where we can direct our attention away from something towards something else, because it's like it's one thing to like want to do the rosary, go to church, but there's another thing resisting this kind of like seductive pull of secular technology.
Yes. Okay. What's so funny about this? Hold on one. My wife and I recently started doing like morning devotionals together, and in today's devotion, today's date the 6th, right? In today's devotion, Mark 7:14 through 23, it is talking about how we tend to view sin and temptation and these forces of the world as external, right? Like these are external pulls that are making me sin. And oh, woe is me because this environment is making me sin. And what Jesus tells us in Mark 7, is that this sin is inside of you. This is your spiritual condition that you need to deal with. And I think that I do think that that sort of attention martial arts is a real thing, but I do think we should, at least in the spiritual technology lens, let's say that, particularly in a religious lens, we should be very clear with ourselves that our actions are just reflections of our desires, and our desires are not always pure. And so I think a good example of this is like porn, right? And the growth of like internet porn. It's just like, yes, the accessibility has never been higher, but if your attraction to that thing was forever your attraction to that thing, and although maybe you couldn't realize it in the same way, meditating on your lust for some sort of sensual desire was equally as a sin as it was 100 years ago as it is today, and you just have the access to it. And so I do think like that sort of attention martial arts is good, but I would be afraid of viewing it as a thing to counter the external and not redirect how your own psyche is working internally. Like I think that is still the primary condition, because to Kat's sort of earlier point of like, we're not active enough. It's like we can tend to not be active enough to ourselves, and I think like that active work on self is the thing that is what spiritual technology is about, because it is an overworking of the self. It's a constant massaging of the self that we have to sort of care for, and allowing that intentionality to override any sort of external force, and that belief that the external forces are having more sway on our sort of spiritual condition. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you're going to stay for the conversational portion, imagine we can jam in a more free-flowing way. The other thing I'll share there is, as I'm Orthodox, I'm biased by the practice of fasting. They like to fast, which they argue brings them closer to God and death to the world. And I think we're just in a different environment right now, especially if our livelihood is tethered to screens. So like kind of like an eye fasting is needed,
Yes.
in addition to the other stuff we're talking about.
What do you guys think of the like dopamine fasting trend that a few big publications had written about? That felt like kind of like, I'm not sure how many people were actually doing that, right? But there's something to it. Like people do isolation tanks and things like this.
I'm pretty pro. I do think okay. So maybe to contradict what I just said, I do think environment plays a really big part of that. Like one thing about living in New York is like I go outside and I'm just sort of like dopamine bum rushed simply as a function of living here, I did a Twitter fast for a month, few months ago, and I will say that was like, I don't want to be dramatic, but it was really healing to my relationship with this thing. Yeah, I think to Peter's point, I do think fasting is maybe not technology, but it is one of those rituals that I think is hyper underutilized today. And I think we can apply it to a lot more areas of our life, and even more niches. Like I think we can do sugar fast. I think we can do Twitter fast, like I did, without it being a full internet fast, so to speak.
One thing I want, we have a few questions, and I'll let people pop in after the one last thought. One fear I have about fasting is like the commodification of fasting. And that was my only thing with the dopamine fasting. Like, is it, or like, what is the purpose of this practice? Is like the practice becoming its own type of object, right? Instead of, you know, doing it as part of some greater framework. So I guess like an analogy to make what I'm trying to say a little clearer is like people who just like do yoga sort of divorced from anything else. There's some people who argue though that like it actually doesn't matter, like doing it at all is good. Like it doesn't necessarily need to be part of a larger fabric. But anyway, I will let other folks jump in. DJ, you're the first hand up I saw, so I'll let you go first. Sorry if I'm neglecting anyone.
Great, thanks. This was terrific. I also read your piece that they had sent out before this, and I'm nodding along to a bunch of it. I'm curious what you think about. I'm not quite sure how to frame this, but there's sort of spiritual, which is a lot of what we're talking about, but there's also religion.
Yes.
And I mean, I've been an atheist since I was like 18, and I've never regretted it. I've never felt like, maybe there's something I'm missing. But I do think there's a lot of other people who could benefit from religion. And this was like really hit home with me in the last few years. I was managing a property in a lower income, very red area of a red state, not to get overly political, but that kind of sets the context. And seeing, and our tenants were working class, and by working class, I don't mean pipe fitters. I mean, they worked at Walmart,
Got it.
And I saw a lot of pathological behavior that I think maybe in years past, they would have worried more about going to hell, if they did those things. And so I'm wondering if there's like for spirituality to really work at scale, maybe there needs to be a coercive element to it as well. I mean, this is a group, I'm guessing, of college educated, upper income, people who kind of fit the weird definition by that book, about those people. And that's not the masses, certainly not globally, and I don't even think within the country. I guess to kind of circle back to the addictive quality of technology. The guy, I can't remember his name, he's a venture capitalist, but he was an advisor to Mark Zuckerberg early on at Facebook. He wrote a book after the 2016 election, went around kind of proselytizing. I can't remember his name, but he pointed out, he said, look, it used to be that we had all these chemical companies back in the early, let's say the Gilded Age up to, let's say, the 1960s, who had a lot of really brilliant engineers who invented all these chemicals, but they just dumped all the waste into the river. Right? And it was an extremely profitable business until we started regulating the waste. And it's still a profitable business, but it's not an extremely profitable business. So you have to own the negative consequences of what you're doing. And Facebook and other social networks, they have these extremely highly paid engineers whose job is to keep you staring at the screen. And so when we talk about temptation, it's not just this thing in the air. There are people whose job it is to tempt you.
Yes.
Is there, I mean, should we think more seriously about government regulation? And then also, like the Silicon Valley ethos, I think part of the reason we saw kind of the left-right split this election between kind of the billionaire elites is because they, like me, I'm an older guy, I'm a Gen X guy who we kind of came of age in the neoliberal era. And I'm still mostly neoliberal in a lot of my political beliefs, but we don't live in a neoliberal moment anymore.
Mm.
And they kind of want to go back to when everything was free and any consequences were yours alone to deal with. And they sort of see the political right as kind of a Trojan horse to, even though we're talking about populist stuff that we tell people what to do and make them do things, what they actually want is, no, we just want a free for all.
Mm.
And you know, how do we respond for that, to that?
Yeah. Uh, I'm glad that we're only doing easy questions. Okay, so I think the guy you're referring to is Chamath Palihapitiya. No. Damn. Okay.
I want to say his name is Mark something or other. He was a venture capitalist. I don't think he does anymore. He went around. He was on like Bill Maher and all those types.
Okay. Okay.
Older guy. He's like probably 60.
Okay.
I'll see if I can Google and find.
Right. Yeah, so oh man. There's a lot baked in there. So I do think that let's just maybe tackle like the government regulation in terms of, when a system is hyper incentivized for a behavior like staring at a screen, right? Like that is a chunk of like Facebook's entire workplace. Sticking just to social media, I do think we're going to look back at this era of social media like we look at pregnant women in the 60s smoking cigarettes. Like, I think we're going to be incredibly shocked that we allowed this to be as total as it is today. But when it comes to regulation has to get designed by someone. And typically we get excited by regulation when our team is the ones in charge, right? So then the question becomes like, who gets to sort of be, who's in charge in the moment that we feel the need the most? And are we actually going to be excited by those things? I think at a high level, we have to ask, what is it that we want to regulate? Is it that we're trying to regulate like Australia recently? I think you have to be 16 now in Australia before you can be able to like join any social media app. That recently happened, right? Is it a thing like drinking age? Is it a thing like we're going to sort of force like cigarette companies, let's say just like medical information permanent on Facebook? Like when you open Facebook, there's a permanent label at the top that like scrolling for too long is bad for your health in this way, and this and this and this is true, and you can't resist it. Is it a campaign question, actually, similar to sort of like the dare programs? Like, what's the dare for social media? I'm not sure, because then we start to get purely into design questions. And we're not necessarily the best at regulating designs. We can do things like cars need seatbelts, but we need airbags. But, are we going to get into full algorithmic design regulation? Do we want that? I don't have a strong answer, but I think when people talk about regulating, particularly social media and its effects, I sit on the more warning label side simply because I think getting government into algorithmic decisions will have a lot weirder consequences, and is far more ripe for censorship and opinion shaping than it is about care and health. There's a second part to your point that wasn't necessarily about regulation and government, though. Maybe it was around neoliberalism vibes.
I'm
Um,
talking about coercion in general, which religion does, self-coercion.
Oh, that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I think starting like that's right, the coercion and religion. I do think that, and like using your example of sort of the folks in the red state work like real sort of like service working class. Um and then the scale of spiritual technology. Okay. So I think the way that we view, and when I say we, I mean like the group of folks that I do sort of like this research with, I think the way that we view sort of this question is like, what is like a high level shared view of the world that maybe from like a comparative religion standpoint, like these good group of folks share. And then what is that secondary layer, which would be the actual specific faiths and their systems and practices and beliefs. I do think in sort of a McLuhan like hyper extended view, the threat of secular technology is the complete destabilization of values. And when I think of sort of compulsive behaviors that are maybe destabilizing or hurtful to the individual, it has to do with just the complete sort of abandonment of values. I've seen it in personal family. I've seen it in peers. I think there's the tension between religious and secular folks is sort of like, where do values emerge from and how are they held? Like how are they held day in and day out? And I think what religion allows for is a sort of moral superiority, not in the individual, and this is where a lot of people mess up with religion, not in the individual's capacity for moral superiority, but in the moral giver and how we are supposed to be in relationship to that moral giver. Obviously, in Christianity, it's the Christian God. My desire for the awakening of folks to spiritual technology is that they become more aware of whatever branch they want to go down, that rerootedness in some sort of moral superiority and how they are meant to live their lives. And not because of some fear structure of you're going to hell, but because of ideally a love and value structure and what that gives to not only themselves, but their broader communal relationships, right? And this kind of goes back to like these social images of church and what's wrong with current social images and what is still beautiful about plenty social images. That's kind of the hope in like scaling some of these ideas. I hope that's clear, DJ.
let's move on to Liza.
I think G Davitz had his question first, sorry.
All right.
I know he lifted his hand first, so
Well, thank you for I will accept your pass and we'll toggle right back to you.
oh, he put it down. Okay.
You can go.
You're up,
Liza. I'll go after. Don't worry.
Okay, so all right. I have a little question written down. Okay. I kind of see technology as being created to optimize our environment, just like a continuous charge towards improving and improving and improving. But I've also noticed in myself and in other people that even spirituality has been adopted with like a similar attitude, like using self-help books, working out, therapy, meditation, even like dopamine fasting, kind of like not just a pure desire to like connect with presence and God, but also having this like ooh, if I wasn't reliant on technology, my brain would be working at 99% functionality and I'd be so powerful. If I were connected to God, the both of us could like it's also adopting almost the same attitude that we create technology with, treating ourselves as like technology that can be improved. And I'm sort of going towards the ambiguous goal of creating the most optimized self. And I'm curious about what your opinion is about this like attitude towards optimization, and even just from going to like just changing the environment to be more optimized towards like trying to change ourselves to be these optimized beings.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And Peter's, I mean, double bars in the chat. Spiritual materialism and spiritual narcissism are fantastic. Good phrases. I'm gonna steal those respectfully. So yeah, I think that is one. I think that's really right? Tech as sort of optimizing our environment. And this is sort of like where those images of utopia come from. Like, oh, like the world if San Francisco actually worked. And it's like that, like super white, clean, sort of like utopian meme, right? So I have this phrase that I mean, some people don't like, but it's like you can only see the cathedral from within. And what that kind of refers to is like the way that stained glass is designed. From the outside, it just looks dull, right? There's actually like no real shape or color to it. And it's only when light shines through stained glass that you actually understand the effect of stained glass. And in order to even see that effect, you have to be within the structure. Okay, so hold that right here. And then the other thing that I like to say is sort of, I think one of the most common things that Americans do in Europe is walk into old cathedrals, and admire the beauty. And then you sort of get the Twitter meme of like, oh, we can't build things like this anymore. And the reason I think that's important is because somewhere along the way, the belief that you could get the effect without the underpinning of what drove that architecture, like we divorce those two things, but you can't divorce those two things. And you only get that beauty with the underpinning of the faith that drove that architecture and effort, right? And there's obviously muddiness there as well. I'm not ignorant to, labor. But the reason I say those two things is because when we sort of attempt spirituality and the divorcing of, let's say, yoga from its spiritual practice, I don't believe you can do that, and I think there was a kind of a weird movement in like Christian circles where they were kind of like vocally anti-yoga, but I think it's actually rooted in something true, which is you can't divorce that practice from its spiritual underpinnings. So I do think there's some merit to those Christians. And I think the problem with secular technology, and the reason why I even use that Soul Cycle example, is because it has this sort of funhouse mirror effect where you really start to believe you can divorce those practices from its spiritual underpinnings. And so then you can apply those things agnostically to your betterment, which is one, an insult to its spiritual underpinnings, and two, an insult to the practice itself, I don't think there's anything like morally wrong with sort of like a quest to be a better person, but I do think it's rooted in the same sort of pride of certainty that Silicon Valley is rooted in, which is by optimizing our environment, we will be better. By optimizing ourselves, we will be better. And yet these same people go out and sort of, cheat on their spouses and create, all these effects that we don't care for. So yeah, I guess the thing that is really critical here is, if there's one thing that I have found in my comparative religion looking, is a sort of shared belief in humility. Like we are meant to be humble under God. And the problem with technology as God is that once you design God, you have the right to pride, But if the point is to get through to God, you will always see yourself as lower than, and that is actually really critical for a humble spirit. Self-optimization has a pride rooting that I think shows its failures time and time again, because to go back to design as an embodiment of values, those values are spurring from the creator. And you can always kind of tell when something is built with pride underneath it. You know, those products tend to have a very specific type of failure. And I don't want to name any of those, but there's a really big difference between a team that approaches work with humbleness versus pride. And I think there's a really big difference in people that view self-improvement through a humble source versus a prideful sort of, I'm going to reach some pinnacle source. And I think technology and like the postmodernist sort of rationalist view is a very prideful source. And that's sort of, yeah, that's kind of my long form on your probe.
Do you want to do your follow-up?
We can continue to the next question.
All right. Let's move on.
Hey, so I'm quite sympathetic to your view. I'm like currently started a startup that's like building something that's a sort of extension of like what's one of Illich's ideas in deschooling society.
Oh yeah. Love that book.
So the thing that I wanted to know is, so a lot of the examples you've given are of kind of physical technologies or like cultural spaces, but in keeping with the theme of this group, I'm curious about design principles and also kind of examples from like the world of software and of just like of sort of purely symbolic technologies, because I think some of the things that you describe are, to me, inherent problems, and kind of in a la McLuhan, like they're like problems of medium as much as they are problems of intent. And so I'm curious about like what a positive vision of sort of symbolic technologies is to you. And if you have examples, I'd love to hear them, and just kind of like how one goes about dealing with this medium, which has a lot of demons in it, right? Be they egregores or otherwise, and how to navigate that in the production of things that are like actually salubrious for humans.
Yeah, that's I mean, that's a really great probe. I had to write that one for myself to come back to. Okay. So I'll start with actually maybe something like I've been sort of playing with myself. So my company, it's a game studio, so very deeply software. I'm very into spatial. And so something I've been very slowly, like disgustingly slowly working on myself is sort of a website, and the entire website is just like a cathedral, and it's sort of like these spatialized sections, and the hope is that you can see other people's cursor when they're on the website at the same time. That's quite skeuomorphic in terms of, you know, sort of like symbolism, but the yes, it might not ever get done, but I do think it's a really good example of sort of your probe around sort of, you know, software specific positive vision. I think I personally deeply believe in spatial technology. I think that it affords a very unique sense of presence, which I think is part of what the internet misses. And it's also why I'm pretty pro, at least in a general neutral sense, of like also video software, because I think it also affords very compelling senses of presence. I think something that, this is a conversation I was having a few days ago, so these thoughts are still really rough. But I think one of the problems with sort of algorithmic technology is that it is inherently, to use a McLuhanism, the rear view mirror, you know, and it is based on stoking emotions through the past. Like it is the reverse of looking forward to your life. And so I would broadly categorize something that I think is positive visions for symbolic technology, specifically software, are presence driving software. And I tend to be quite attracted to presence driving software to a commercial flaw point of myself. And so I actually do think, so I think real-time spatial, I think games are very powerful, because I think, you know, play and education are very symbiotic. And I think more presence-driven things like sort of, I don't know if you would consider this sort of a, you know, a club of some sorts, but clubs that like meet in real time and carve out space in their day, for communing that they can go back and meditate on, you know, because it was live and generative with other humans. I think that those are all really positive visions for symbolic technologies. And then I think the final one on sort of like presence driven software is software that can drive presence for the self, right? So maybe a very obvious one could be something like Calm, right? Or there's like, I think there's a Catholic app called like Halo or Hallow. I think it's Hallow. There was this designer is kind of going through some personal woes, so I won't name them, but they designed this app that was basically a mirror. It just used your like selfie cam to create a mirror, but I think there was like some visual gloss on it that made it more mirror-like. And when you waited there for like 5 seconds, an AI generated prompt would come up, and you can't type and you can't even take a screenshot, like all of that is disabled, but it's meant for you to like sit and reflect with yourself on this prompted question. And it was like a new one every day, and you got like a timer. That to me was also like a really beautiful presence driving technology. And then the final example, my friend Laurent, who used to work at Snap, really incredible designer, made this thing called, during COVID, called the Presence Project. And basically you can imagine like just a pure color, and you put your finger down and you can like start moving it. And when anyone else was on the app, it added a new color. And so what you were seeing were people dragging their fingers around and kind of interplaying with each other, almost as if like they were drawing in sand together. And there was no voice chat or anything, but it was really interesting to get like small buzzes of like people are present here, and then playing with them in this way. And then even just thinking about like who might be on the other side of this screen. You know, I think that was just like even a beautiful meditation that the technology brought up. And I think so, yeah, I think these presence projects are really wonderful and can induce a very centering effect that's very different than like algorithmic social based things.
Did we have any questions in the chat that I missed? If so, if you could just repost even if you just copy and paste it. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak before we do a short break.
Yeah. The cathedrals in Minecraft is a really good example. I mean, Minecraft is just so special.